Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. You guys are the early birds, so we're letting you in so that you can get situated. We'll get started here in just a moment as other folks trickle in. But we're really excited that you've allotted some time to be with us today and looking forward to learning from not only our speakers, but also from all of you. There will be a chance a little bit later. We're going to use the breakout feature, so you'll get a chance to participate in the conversation and really engage with some of the content that we'll hear. So as we get started, I want to invite everybody to go ahead and make use of the chat feature and let us know where you're from, where you're tuning in from. We'd love to know who's on the line and give us some context. So please do that as you're joining us. Again, welcome. This is Being the Church Post-COVID. My name is Chiva Hawkins, and I will be a bit of a host today. I'm going to be introducing some friends of mine who have great insight to share, and looking forward to learning about the distributed church. So that's what we've signed up for here today. It is the top of the hour, so without further ado, I am going to invite us to go ahead and get started. Again, welcome everybody. It's great that you are here. This is being brought to you by a consortium of leaders who come together under the banner of the Seattle Church Planting Coalition, which is a network of networks, a group of leaders that I've been privileged to learn from, including Gary Irby, who is the director of this mayhem and mess and in charge of church planting here in the Northwest, throughout the region for the SPC, along with his teammate and colleague Natalie, who is behind the scenes helping make things happen. My friend Micah Dodson is here from Thrive Church Planting. He's based in Portland, but also serves church planters throughout the West. And then in a moment, we're going to hear from Dr. Dave DeVries, who is the founder of Missional Challenge, and also the Western Regional Director of the Missionary Church. And the thing that we like to say about Dave is he's a coach who coaches coaching, or coaches on coaching. So he's a big L leader. So really excited to hear from him. And he's brought a friend today to share with us about being the distributed church. So again, as you're joining us, please do let us know where you're coming from in the chat. And know the one thing about the Church Planting Coalition that we're a part of is we're a kingdom-minded group. We come together from different networks, denominations, organizations, tribes, all for the sake of Christ. So that's what binds us all together. That's what we have in common. That's how we're excited that you all are here. So thank you for joining us today. And again, we'll have a chance to interact and dialogue with one another throughout this conversation as we break off into some breakout groups. So without further ado, Dr. Dave DeVries, welcome. Thank you for being here. I know we were saying just a moment ago, you shared some of your insights with us previously, and we just geeked out. I know I did. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you today. Excited to hear what you have to share about the distributed church.
Well, thank you so much, Chivo. It's great to be together, and I am so eager to share some of these ideas today. Really just thankful for the way that the Lord is working in and through his church in this COVID era. And you know, there's a lot of people that are just eager to get back to the way that we used to do church, and I'm not in that camp. I'm in the camp that says I can't wait to see what God wants to do through his church in new ways as a result of and continuing what he began before COVID. So I'm really excited to share with you some ideas that might stretch your thinking today on that whole subject. And I'm super grateful to have my good friend Steve Bagdanov join us today. Steve is in Southern California and has been in ministry for 30 plus years, and has some great perspective to add to our discussion today. So
we'll see about that.
We'll see about that. Yeah. So I just want to say thank you, Steve, for your willingness to join as we jump in here. And I'm going to do my best to share a little bit of my screen as we go along in this presentation, talking about the distributed church. And I do want to say this is a continuation of a 4-part webinar series that we've put together. So if you missed the first part that Chivo facilitated last time, I want to encourage you. You can catch the replay of that webinar by going to the registration page for the webinar series, and you can see that posted there. And as well, after this webinar today, it will also be posted, and the additional webinars that are to come. So in the first webinar we had a couple weeks ago, Chivo really introduced the series, talked to us about the reality of the church being phygital, functioning in a physical world as well as the digital world. And I really loved the question of, can a biblical church be digital? Or even then they twisted that back on us. Can a biblical church not be digital? And I think there's some great discussion that came out of that. And we want to really just build on that in our session today. So let's jump right in. We're going to talk about really the distributed church and what that looks like. And when I begin to think about what is a church, I view the church in terms of its identity, its function, and its form. And as I think about those three things, the identity of the church, the function of the church, and the form of the church, all of those inform the way that we think about church. And two ideas that I think are really foundational for me is, first, this concept that being precedes doing, right? What I do flows out of who I am. That's true about me personally, and that's also true, I believe, about the church. What the church does flows out of who the church is. It's also the same when we think about God. What God does flows out of who God is. So being precedes doing. And so as we think about what the church is, we need to start first with identity and then understand function and the interaction between those. The second thing to think about is that form follows function. And there are essential functions that we see described in the church, but there are a variety of expressions of what that looks like. If any of you have traveled internationally and interacted with the body of Christ in other countries or in other languages, you discover that in different contexts, the form of church may be very different, yet the functions of the church are very, very similar.
So at this point, Dave, sometimes in our conversations, I would push back on Dave at this point. And because there also seems to be a symbiotic relationship between these different categories, that you could actually flip the sentences. And in some senses, what we do starts to affect who we see ourselves as. What we do affects how we form things. So even in the structures of our churches, you think about the form that we've built, just the basic architectural form determines what we do. And at some point, you've got to ask the question, have we created the right forms? And so at some point, you got to flip the switch and say, is this the right function? Are we doing the right things? And then how does that affect the forms that we've created and the forms that we will create moving forward? I think that's an important thing to start thinking about, especially if you're going to be innovative or nimble or agile as you approach the problems of the future and ministry.
Thanks, Steve. I love it when you push back on me. So let's keep doing that as we move forward. And let's just kind of zero in a little bit on these concepts of identity, function, and form. So I believe that in order to understand the church, we need to recognize that what a church is flows out of who God is, that there is a distinct relationship with the church being the people of God, being the body of Christ, being the fellowship of the Spirit. And as I understand the church really is the people of God on mission with God, sent to a specific people, language, geography, culture, or context. And it's important for us as we begin to imagine how the church will function post-COVID, that we understand foundationally who we are from an identity standpoint. We are God's people. We are on mission with God. We are sent by God to the context to which we live, where He has sent us on mission.
Yeah.
When I think about
wait, before you go on,
yeah,
let's go back one thing. I think the other thing, just to build on that contrast or pushback, is that when we think about the Trinity, or we think about God and His form resulting in His function, or His identity resulting in a function, He's perfect. So that strategy works really well, but we aren't. So, and neither is the church. So at some point you've got to say, just because it is doesn't mean it is what it should be. And that's where I think we constantly have to come back and evaluate those forms that we've decided or declared or just fallen into, and say, is this the form we need to use? And from our perspective, being subject to change, we're not immutable. Form has to remain malleable, I think, when we think about church.
So true. I think the reality is we can get too attached to our form, or I can fall in love with form. I love the way that we worship when I mean, I've already told my wife when I die that at my memorial service I want them to sing the doxology and the Gloria Patri. And you say, well, why would you choose that? And I said, well, because that's part of the tradition of church that I grew up in the RCA. And it has great meaning for me. By the time I die, it's possible nobody's going to know those songs, but we'll see what happens. But there's a sense where we can fall in love with our own liturgy or our own form, and really not understand that church is not defined primarily by form. It's defined by our identity and function. And the essential descriptions that we see, we talked last time about Acts chapter 2. We talked about the essentials of what a church does. They help us to understand if a church is actually functioning as a church. And worship, evangelism, disciple making, fellowship, ministry, all of these things are important as we see the church function.
Yeah, and I think all of us, if we had one-on-one discussions, might put these in different order of priority, or maybe say, hey, something's missing. Like where is ministry to the poor in this paradigm here? Are these 5 elements, and how is that reflected in our forms? And maybe because those things aren't done, we're not doing them, points out to some of that underlying form misshapenness, if I can use that phrase.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think too, when we think about ministry, a lot of times as a pastor, my view of ministry was, how can you serve us in the church? And we take a total internal focus rather than looking at ministry as an extension of the work of the Spirit in our community. How do we engage those who are far from God and use the gifts that God has given us to serve the poor, or to serve at a park, or in the needs that are around us? Yeah. Moving next then comes form. And many churches that I'm familiar with have quite a formal structure, but there are also informal and non-formal structures. And I think it's important for us to understand that how a church is formed is not what defines it as a church. Here's some things that we often look at, though, as it relates to structure. Do you have credentialed pastors? Do you have defined membership? Have your members been baptized? Do you have written bylaws, or do you have a leadership board or an elder board in place? Do you have an annual budget? Do you have a bank account? Do you have your 501c3 status? Do you have an EIN? All of these elements are related to the form or structure of the church. But these are not elements that we see certainly in Acts chapter 2, helping us understand how a church functions. Our view of the church, I believe, is influenced by all three of these. What we see as the church's identity, what we see as the function, and then what we see as form. Now, how have you seen that challenged, Steve, or worked out?
Yeah, so recently I started a project, and the project was trying to figure out how to bridge the gap in starting a worshiping community, a new church that would bridge the gap between race and culture and class. How are those things, why are those things not happening naturally and organically in the church? Why do we have segregated churches? Why do we have churches that are typically upper class, middle class, or lower class? And then how is the church really reaching the lowest of the low? And if I'm going to plant a church in that context, now I'm up against the challenges of the forms. I've said that every church plant within 3 years, no matter what model you start, will feel the pressure of the form of the pews and the pulpits. And that's because our money's going to run out. We've got to support ourselves, and we've got to get a base of people that's going to support the ministry. And that's how we do it. And so that ministry, I think, is lacking because the form constricts it. And in order to do that, you've got to somehow think around the forms, manipulate the forms, use forms differently to try to accomplish that task. And so in that instance, for me, the form of the church, which I love so much, became this huge barrier to my success in my venture. And it caused problems. I was really challenged with how to figure out how to make that happen long term. And so I think that's one of the critical areas that needs to kind of be talked about on a broader level, as opposed to just leaving it to the few church planters or mission-oriented people who make those sorts of ventures. And that's important, because it needs to be a broader effort and a broader conversation.
Yeah. Well, in just 2 minutes, we're going to jump into our breakout rooms, and that might be a time to even start wrestling with that question. And this attachment to form, I think, is important to pay attention to. I want to focus in on 3 different concepts related to form, or what I would consider the formal church or on-site church. It's more of a convergence model. We all gather together for weekly worship, for fellowship, for ministry. We either own or construct a building or meet in a rented space. There's paid staff, and it's a centripetal focus. Everything is toward moving people toward the center of our worship gathering. And everything is viewed in terms of that church building and that gathering space. There's also informal church, which happens in an online context. And this is more emergence in this last couple decades, where services can be streamed for worship. Fellowship can happen virtually in community and ministry. You can meet anywhere and anytime. You aren't limited to a building. There's more of a centrifugal focus, or that spinning outward rather than spinning inward. And geography doesn't necessarily become a limiting factor. And then the third area is more of an organic or non-formal church. This is a more submerged model. You don't see physical structures or necessarily even a visible presence of, oh, look, there's that church. It's uber relational, meals are central, people meeting in circles, not rows, and a fractal focus. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I want to go ahead and challenge you to think about form and function and identity. So we're going to jump into breakout groups. We're going to assign these randomly, and you're going to have about the next 10 minutes to consider how you view church as identity, function, or form, and then how does that impact your ministry strategy. We'll be back in 10 minutes. Well, welcome back. I hope you found your time in your breakout room encouraging. How about some thumbs up or some sort of sign if it was good? Okay, awesome. I really appreciated the golden nuggets that I was writing down in insights. It was really, really good time spent together. I want to kind of move forward here into unpacking a little bit more what this distributed church looks like. And at the start of COVID, you know, people started working from home and doing remote work. And my buddy here, Steve, listened to a podcast on distributed work with Matt Mullenweg. And he shared it with me, and I listened to the podcast. And all of a sudden, I had my eyes opened to some amazing, what do you say, ideas about how work was being viewed differently. And it helped Steve and I to engage in conversations during COVID of how church might be different than it had ever been before. And so I want to maybe just have Steve share a little bit about how we got started on this conversation, and unmute yourself as you do.
So Matt Mullenweg is the founder of WordPress, and he now owns a company called Automatic, which is a spinoff of WordPress. WordPress, if you don't know, is fast becoming the major platform for every web page that you go to. The New York Times is built on WordPress, for instance. I think it's 36% of all websites are run by WordPress. So WordPress, WooCommerce, Tumblr, Jetpack, those are all companies underneath Automatic. They have 1,200 employees in over 75 countries, and they do not have a physical building anymore. I think, actually, I take that back. I think they have a physical building in San Francisco, but they only use it for meetings that they need to. All of their employees are working distributed. And just to emphasize the importance of language, they don't call it remote or telecommuting, because what that did was it seemed to prioritize or make essential those workers who were in an office, and non-essential those who were working remotely. And so they wanted to remove that, and so they called it the distributed church to avoid that mistake. And now they have an advantage. They're a tech company, so it's easy. They're not a factory or a restaurant. And I think there are some elements in the church where, you know, obviously we look at them, we can't do everything remotely. We want to gather together, and that's a key thing. But when I thought about that, I just was really challenged, because many of the things that I heard him saying were not, we just want to accommodate people who want to stay home, but this is a better way to do this. So that's what really struck me, is that, is there a better way to do church? And in many ways, the COVID disaster has brought us to a place where maybe we're having another Acts 1 moment, right? Where persecution drove a diaspora. And so maybe this is a COVID diaspora that we're facing. And it causes us then to say, can we see this as a work of the Spirit moving us outside of our boundaries, outside of our restrictions, outside of our enclosures, outside of our silos, to better do the work of ministry in the world? And that was just really the thing I took away from that. It was impressive, and it was challenging. And so there's got to be some crossover as we talk about the church.
Thanks, Steve. I want to kind of build on some of the concepts that we began to discuss together. And I want to kind of just walk through with you these different phases of what a distributed church looks like. And some of this might be familiar, some of this might be brand new. I'm going to kind of walk through each of these from unavailable to unintentional to remote to intentional to integrated to automated, and help you have an understanding of how your church might be at one of these phases now, and even to have you consider at what phase would you want to be. What makes sense to you in terms of how your church could function in a more distributed model. So we start with phase 0. Basically, the church is not distributed. Essentially, everything happens on site. So if you can't make it to the building, you can't be a part of the church. And for many churches, that's how they function for a very, very long time. The next phase, I would call unintentional. We provide access to the worship experience. You can get the recording if you weren't there. You can buy now it's not a tape or a CD anymore. Maybe you can download the digital file.
Dating yourself.
Yeah, I know. But that's not the design, right? The focus is on our on-campus ministries. Online is not a part of our strategy at all. And groups, they're optional, but not essential to the way that our church functions. And there are many churches in our country that I would say they're at this unintentional phase, okay? The second phase here is remote. And this is where you offer online services. It's available. We might even promote it, but that's not preferred. The worship service doesn't change in any way. All we do is broadcast what was on the platform to a digital audience. And we can't wait for you to get back to be with us in the building on Sunday. So it's possible if you're sick or if you're traveling, we have remote access available for you, but we really want you here with us. That's what the church is really all about. There might be some organic group life, but we would tell people if you had to choose between meeting in your small group this week or going to church on Sunday, you better be in church. Now that's the message. And the analogy that was shared with me was this idea of when radio was first introduced. Now, radio's only been around for about 115 years. The first radio broadcast was in 1906. The first commercial radio broadcast was about 100 years ago in 1920. And those little beautiful transistor radios that I used to have and listen to the baseball game when I wanted to hear the Dodgers, those have only been around since 1954. Something to think about in terms of technology. But when radio was new, they would broadcast Broadway musicals and Broadway plays over the radio. Nothing was changed. They just took the live performance and made it so you can listen. If you had never attended that musical or that play, it may be difficult because you didn't have the visual to actually understand what was going on. Fast forward many years, and they introduced something that you may be familiar with called radio theater. And they actually created programs for the radio. And families would gather around the radio on Sunday evenings to listen to The Lone Ranger, right? And there was this sense where they took the medium and they created a new form to be able to deliver something that was of value. I look at that transition as it relates to the church of entering this phase 3, being intentional, where online worship becomes its own unique ministry or its own campus. And community online is fostered with intention, whether that's gathering in homes in a micro context or in an individual context. And what begins to happen with intentionality is we say, hey, we need someone to pastor the people who are engaging with our congregation online. And we have an on-campus, online, and organic ministry, and we value those equally. There's intentionality to the way that we view how the church functions. Phase 4 is then more integrated, where members begin to engage with one another through the online activities as well as through the on-site activities. And geography doesn't become a limit for belonging. You can live in another state and still be connected to a church family, because the church is built on the relational community, not necessarily you have to live within driving distance of the building. And growth and engagement then begins to increase, whether you're joining online, whether you're joining by being physically on site, or you're meeting in that organic expression in a home or around a table somewhere. The final phase is more of an automated perspective, where church is happening simultaneously in online, on-site, and organic expression. And we aren't challenging people. You have to choose to be a part of one. You can join in all three of these expressions of what it means to be church. And there's this seamless sense of connectedness through presence as well as through technology. There are micro locations that are fueled by the people who are involved in them, not by whether or not you have a building or you have a paid pastor or staff. And there's 24/7 accessibility. Now, as I think about all that, one of the shifts that happens in my head is, wait a minute, can someone actually belong if they never walk into the building? Would we have room for someone to be a church, a member, a fully functioning part of our community, but they never showed up in our church building? Steve, why don't you add some color to all of that?
So I challenged Dave on all these new words. And one of the things I told him was, I'm not comfortable with the word automated. And yeah, I think it's important as we think about this whole idea, and especially thinking about change in general, that language is so important. And so using different words, and we used a lot today: convergence, emergence, submergence, distributed church, integrated, automated, as it describes the church. And you might be disconcerted a little bit that we haven't used any Bible verses. And yet I think we're committed to the end game. And that was the other thing that I felt was really important in hearing Matt Mullenweg talk, is that they're accomplishing what they set out to do using a different form. And I think that we have to look really closely at ourselves and ask the question, and I think probably if you're on this call, if you're on this webinar, at some point, what drove you in this direction in ministry was dissatisfaction with the results we were getting in church. It's like, it's not working. It doesn't feel like it's working. And so there was that sense of dissatisfaction. And so rethinking things and using different terms is helpful. And then I think the other thing to ask is, why does this matter? That's probably the other thing that's ringing in your ears. Why does this, like, I'm in a theology class all over again, as all this new stuff. Why does this matter? It matters because I think as time changes, as our culture changes, we have to be nimble and agile. I like those words to describe the church, but it's a future description, because it certainly isn't nimble and agile now. And I think a lot of that has to do with an overemphasis on one particular form of the church. And so I appreciated Dave using all these different words as I engaged with him over the last couple of months. We've been talking about this for a while. You know, it's like, what is that word? Where did he get that word? Why is he using that word? But it caused me to just think differently. And I think that's hugely important. None of you are going to, you know, move too far out of the box, I don't think, without a Bible verse in our notes today. You have a good foundation already, or else you wouldn't be here. So just having concepts, ideas that help us move forward is critical.
Thanks, Steve. Well, I want you to wrestle with this. And if you haven't already, I would strongly encourage you to download the slides, that the PDF that's in the chat, so that you can kind of look at these phases. And during this breakout group, it'd be great to have you look at what phase describes your church and maybe where do you want to be? And then discuss what is the nature of change that'd be necessary to function at phase 3, phase 4, phase 5, and maybe what would it take for you to get there? What would you need to stop doing? So we're going to hop into these breakouts for the next 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll come back. So have some good discussion. All right, wow, you gotta love coming back right in the middle of conversation, and here we are. So again, hope that you had some meaningful discussion, even just trying to identify where you were in these phases, or maybe even where you want to move to. We're gonna kind of shift into our final gear as we talk about what it means to really be the church versus simply doing church. And I think one of the perspectives that, you know, really has had to change for me personally is that I grew up, you know, really viewing church as a destination, that church was somewhere that we went to be with God. It was the place of God, not necessarily the people of God. And I want to just read to you a quick little story that Jerry Cook told about a conversation that he had with Dr. Richard Halverson, who was the former chaplain of the U.S. Senate, pastored a large church in Washington, D.C. And after speaking one day, Dr. Halverson engaged with some students, and they related this story. Someone asked him the question, Dr. Halverson, where is your church? And he said, well, we get together at a building on 4th Street, but we don't spend much time there. We're mostly in the city. And he said, looking at his watch, it's 3 o'clock in DC, and the church that I pastor is all over the city. It's driving buses, serving meals in restaurants, having discussions in the Pentagon, deliberating in Congress. And I love the reality that he knew exactly where his church was. And he went on and on about where his church was in the city. And then he added, he said, periodically, we get together at a building on 4th Street, but we don't spend much time there. We're mostly in the city. And I really think it's necessary for us to shift the way we view the church. And my challenge to many church planters has been the idea that we need to remove the queen. And I don't know if you're a chess player. I have to admit that I'm not much of a chess player. Watching the Queen's Gambit, I got interested in playing chess, but I'm really not good. And someone offered to me this idea, Dave, if you really want to be a better chess player, you need to simply surrender your queen at the beginning of the game. And if you would give up your queen, then it would force you to learn to use the other pieces on the board. And once you learned how to win without the queen, then when you added the queen back in, you would be more effective. And I think this is a great analogy for us when we think about the church, because I'll admit, when I was pastoring, the Queen was the Sunday morning worship gathering. And we depended on the Queen to accomplish everything, all of those functions of the church: worship and discipleship and even evangelism. We'd invite people to surrender their life to Jesus if they weren't yet a Christ follower, and we'd do ministry, and we'd have fellowship, and we depended on the Sunday morning worship gathering for everything. And I like to challenge churches to consider: stop worshiping on Sunday in the building. And before COVID, I'd get raised eyebrows and people definitely saying we could never do that. Our church would cease to exist. And one of the things I love about this last year is that people have had to discover how to be the church without meeting in their building on Sunday. Now, I have to admit, what I didn't anticipate was that they would emphasize so much what happened in that building that they simply broadcasted into homes all over the place. But I wonder what would happen if we really decided that we weren't going to emphasize the Queen of the Sunday morning worship gathering as the most important factor in how we do church. If we actually could embrace a distributed model that would strive for the integration of non-formal, informal, and formal expressions without valuing one over the other. What would happen if we stopped viewing the church as platform and pews, and we stopped and started viewing the church more as Jesus described it, of vine and branches? What would happen? One of the challenges, and this was mentioned in one of our groups earlier today, there's a sense where to be a church, you've been trained as pastors to study the Bible, to write sermons, and to preach to the congregation. That's what you've been trained to do. And the people in the church, what have we trained them to do? We've trained them to sit, to stand, to sing, to pray along silently, to reflect, to take communion. But it's a whole lot of pastors are trained to preach and people are trained for pew sitting. Pastors are trained for the platform, people are trained for the pew, and we call that church. And I'd like to suggest, what if it was possible to integrate a sense of community that went beyond what happens in the building? And so I have this chart that I'm not going to unpack the whole context for you, but each one of them focuses on a different sense of place, a different sense of how people learn, a different aspect of leadership. And there are non-formal churches, there are formal churches, there are informal churches. I want you to look specifically here at the metric, what gets measured. And in a formal church, what gets measured is whether or not you attend. And so we're measuring and desiring more people to attend on Sunday. In an informal church online, we're measuring views. We want more people that are watching. In a non-formal church, what we're after is more people sharing meals around tables, having spiritual conversations. And I wonder if we were to look at a distributed church, if we might consider a metric that was about more actual connection. How are our people connecting throughout the week and on Sunday? And what is the depth of that connection? And what if we could measure the generations of connection that are taking place through our church with the body of Christ in our context, in our city, in our town, in our village, in our community. I mentioned earlier this sense of motion, and in a formal context of a church, that motion is going inward. In a online context, informal, I see that motion going outward in a centrifugal manner. In a non-formal context, it's more of a fractal image, where a fractal is a geometric figure where each part has the same statistical character as the whole. And maybe you've seen this in a snowflake, where it reflects, each part is geometrically similar to the other, or like a crystal. And I love that image of a fractal, because it demonstrates a recurring pattern that's repeatable. And I think when we focus on buildings as our definition for church, or being in the building, we have a model that isn't as easily repeatable as I think Jesus had in mind when he sent his disciples to make disciples to make disciples. And I wonder what would happen if we could integrate all of these things together to be the sent people of God in our community, and focus more on connection than on attendance or views, or even how many people showed up in your home around a table. So, Steve, with that, give some reflection.
Well, first of all, it bears repeating. I don't know if we repeated this, it was in our small group that we said this, that I don't think you want to look at these things as either ors. It's a little deceptive. David started his first expression of distributed church with a 0 on that one thing, and then 1, 2, and he gave the impression 5 was the best. And I'm thinking that's probably part of the presentation, but it's not all of it. It's not an either or, it's an integration, and it's a broadening of your view about how to do church. About midway through my ministry, I talked to another pastor who was pastor of a very fast growing church. And we eventually got down to the question, how much time do you spend on sermon prep? He said an hour. I got offended. I spent 20. And Monday I was in Greek. So, I mean, I took this part of the job seriously. It was the job. It was the church for me. And I just went, well, how can you only spend an hour? I mean, and the other thing, the point of the story is, it forced me to think about what's he doing with the other 19 hours. And so I started thinking about that. It's like, is sermon prep the only thing I should be doing? Is it the most important thing I should be doing? And I came to the conclusion that I still love it. I still was going to spend a lot of time on it, but it wasn't the most important thing that I could do. And that was because I felt like there was other things that needed to happen that I was neglecting. And part of them are on this chart. And when we talk about discipleship, we're not discipling people to be preachers. We're discipling people to be fully formed followers of Jesus Christ. And so that and sermon prep were, you know, the equation was overloaded. So I think this chart is helpful in helping us to think outside of the box, and to think outside of the structures and habits that we've developed as pastors, and what we think we should be doing, pastors and church leaders. The other thing I think that's important here is to think regionally. Maybe these things can be done in partnership with other local churches. So as we go into this next breakout group session, you want to think about what metric matters most to you, and what kind of steps can you take towards moving more towards a distributed model, or a fuller model, if you like that word better.
Well, howdy. Great to be back, and thank you so much for your participation today. I hope you're being challenged and encouraged. Before we kind of land the plane for today, I want to introduce Gary Irby one more time, because Gary's going to lead our webinar in 2 weeks. And I'd love to know, Gary, what do you have in mind for us? And you might need to unmute again. Sorry, bud.
All right, didn't realize I got muted again. I apologize. Yeah, so we're going to get into some of the practical. We're going to hear from 3 different pastors about how they are being the distributed church. You remember the overall focus of what we're doing in these webinars is what will the church be post-COVID? And the idea that so many times we as the church are the last ones to the ball game. Why not learn and get there ahead of the game? So we're going to hear from John Fredericks of Discovery Community Church in Tacoma, Washington. And in his church, he planted this church some time ago, had grown to a certain size, and they got booted out of the school because of COVID. So they were going to do some things about multiplying and planting, and this kind of forced their hand. It's like they were kind of pushed out in the water and told to swim. And so we're going to hear about how that's led to some planting and multi-site things like that. We're going to hear from Kevin Moore, who was pastor of a church he planted in Visalia, California, working with the missionary church with Dave and with others. And he was pastor of a church there, but he is now planting a church in a county kind of northwest a little bit of Fort Wayne, Indiana, which actually was where I was born. And it's very much a digital approach. He's going to talk about how they go from the digital to the organic home church, and then from that gatherings, and in a very intentional process that includes leadership development, discipleship, and all that. And we're also going to hear from Keith Weiser. He's the pastor of Resonate Church. Resonate is a collegiate church plant that he started at Washington State University a bit over a decade ago, but they've continued planting, and their goal was to be in 21 college towns by 2021. COVID slowed that down a bit. They're in 11. They're actually starting 5 new locations this year. And you'll talk some about that, but some of what's happening in all that is because they went digital, what's happening with what he calls seed churches and how these more organic expressions are popping up. And so we're going to hear from each of these guys. I mean, every single one of them could be an entire webinar, but we're going to hear from each of them, some dialogue with me, then some Q&A from you briefly, and then we're going to go into the breakout rooms and start to talk about how some of these things can have practical implications for your setting. So that's the plan. We'll talk really fast because we have a lot to cover. So.
Oh man, that sounds great, Gary. So thank you so much for setting that up, and we will be back together in 2 weeks. If you were registered for this particular webinar, you'll get the invitation to come back and join us for the next webinar and for the one after that. So you can expect those invitations and those details to come via email. I would also say if you have friends and colleagues and others that you think might be benefiting from this webinar series, we do have 2 more sessions, and the recordings will be available online on that registration webpage, so you can be a part of that as well. We've got about 3 minutes before I want to completely land this plane. We had a few questions show up earlier in the through the breakouts. So I'd like to just take on one thought. Somebody asked, where are churches advancing into phase 4 or phase 5 and doing more of the integrated or automated expressions. One church that's local that you might be familiar with is Church Home in Kirkland with Pastor Judah Smith. And if you haven't checked out their online app, I would encourage you to look at that as a tool that they are using to provide encouragement and support in their discipleship process, to provide virtual community and prayer and teaching and training. And they've actually established small groups that meet nationally in different contexts. That'd just be one example that I think you could look at of a church that's functioning in more of a automated context of a seamless integration between digital and more formal gatherings, as well as the organic small groups. One of the things also I just want to clarify, when we use the word automated, and Steve had mentioned, that word sounds a little weird when you relate it to church. When I say automated, I'm not introducing the idea of digital only as the way that the church would function in the future. When we talk about automated, it's more of a seamless integration. So people are moving in and out of a virtual context, a live context, and interacting on an ongoing basis. So anyway, we can have more conversation about that. Feel free to contact me or contact Steve. Our information is on the end of that slide packet, and I think you'll get it sent in the follow-up email as well. So the other thing I just want to say is we're all in process, and God has uniquely gifted us to be a visible expression of his church where he has called us to serve. And I personally, I don't like the term online church. I don't like the term digital church. I think I've really come to embrace more the idea of virtual community. What does it look like to be in virtual community with others, which includes interaction through this device, interaction through potentially emails and phone calls, etc. But I believe that we have an incredible opportunity to be the church in visible and virtual, tangible ways, and to bring the love of Jesus to every single person where we live, work, learn, and play. So I hope you'll continue to be challenged and join us in our conversations as we learn and flesh out what that looks like. So with that, I want to say thank you. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.